I'm Mr. Ramsey, saving Western civilization, one student at a time. In this lecture, we're going to discuss how Hitler took over Europe, starting off in 1936, his occupation of the Rhineland, which was a violation of the Versailles Treaty signed in 1919. He violated it by actually entering into the Rhine region, sending his troops there. There was supposed to be a demilitarized zone. The reason why they had that as a demilitarized zone is because they were stopping German aggression, and so they made it a demilitarized zone so that Germany would no longer threaten France. They had invaded France during the Napoleonic Wars. Then they invaded France again in 1870, and they invaded France again in 1914. And so the Allied powers decided that they need to make sure that Hitler, or Germany in particular, would not do that again. But they violated it in 1936, which is one of the many things that happened in 1936. So you had several major things that happened in 1936. You have Ethiopia being taken over by the Italians. You have the march into the Rhineland. And then you also have the Rome-Berlin Axis being formed. The last major thing that happened in 1936 was the Spanish Civil War. And what happens is, in 1931, King Alfonso XIII abdicated and Spain became a republican form of government. And because of that, people wanted a more socialistic, communistic state. Not everyone, but several people did. And in 1936, those people were elected. And they were passing anti-clerical laws, and they're shutting down churches, sending them to public education, shutting down church schools. And so in July of 1936, Francisco Franco led a coup d'etat against the Republican government. So you have in Spain a civil war between the nationalist and the loyalist. People like to call it fascist versus the socialist, or fascist versus the communist, but it's a little more complex than that, because you have a whole bunch of they call Francisco Franco a fascist, but he just had fascist, the Falange, side with him, but he had a whole bunch of other people too, like the Carlists, the church, all these different, the conservatives. You had a whole hodgepodge of groups versus the anarchists, socialist, and communist. And Francisco Franco, who is considered a nationalist for nationalist Spain, was getting money for both the Italians and the Germans. And the Republicans, or the loyalist, or the government that was there, was getting their money from Joseph Stalin. And so that's the reason why people make it, they simplify it between the fascist and the communist, which actually is a little more complex than that. Usually things are. Anyway, so you had 3 years of fighting in Spain, okay, where Hitler and Stalin were testing out their new strategies and their new equipment. So, as a matter of fact, volunteers from Britain, France, and the United States flocked to the Republican liberal cause called the International Brigade, where they said that they'd fight against fascism. And so the governments of Western Europe didn't get involved. France didn't get involved. The United States didn't get involved. The UK didn't get involved. Okay? And so Adolf Hitler used different strategies. Well, let Francisco Franco borrow equipment and send aid to Francisco Franco, while the Republicans got their aid from Stalin. As a matter of fact, Stalin, one of the reasons why the Republicans lost the war was because Stalin started pulling his aid, because he wanted a communist state in Spain, and so he withdrew a lot of his aid because he was taking the aid that was supposed to be used for Spain. Anyway, Hermann Goering, who is the head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, actually tested out his strategies in Spain with his Condor Legion, which is an all-German air and ground force. Okay, and matter of fact, there's a painting by Picasso to talk about when the Condor Legion bombed a city in Spain, and that city is Guernica. So that's the name of the city, but it's also the name of the painting by Pablo Picasso. So when the Soviets stopped sending aid to the Loyalists, the Spanish general Francisco Franco launched his final offensive, and by March of 1939, Franco enters Madrid, the last of the Loyalist strongholds, and the Civil War ended, and Spain was ruled by Francisco Franco. But he doesn't enter the war. He's actually the military dictator of Spain from 1939 to 1975 when he dies. So Hitler tests out his war machine, his blitzkrieg tactics, in Spain, and then he's ready to proceed to the rest of Europe. So his first goal after 1936, which, by the way, he had several things happen, and I wanted to also mention that he actually hosted the Olympic Games in Berlin in 1936. So after 1936, he then goes and starts to make his Greater Germany, and it goes his second time for the Auschwitz in 1938. This time, though, Mussolini is on Germany's side, and so he has no problems entering Austria.
Since the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, there have been only a few really momentous days in the history of Europe. Mussolini marching on Rome, Stalin launching his first 5-year plan, Hitler breaking the bonds of Versailles one by one. Today comes another such mighty moment, as Hitler's bond bursting finally carries Nazi expansion across the borders of Germany into the land of his birth. As officials pull down the frontier barriers, the political significance of these pictures is still too fresh in the minds of the world to need discussion. So without comment, we present the story of Germany's march into Austria, across the bridge over the river Salza into Salzburg. German cameramen have sent us pictures of school children saluting the armored cars as they pass, of Austrian frontier guards welcoming German officers and riding side by side with them along the frontier road.
So in March 1938, Hitler sends his German troops into Austria and then proclaims it part of the German Reich. And England and France do nothing. He violates the Versailles Treaty again. Which, by the way, you should know about the Auschwitz because you know this movie. Auschwitz is about, or the Sound of Music takes place, or the setting is the Auschwitz of 1938. So you should know that. Anyway, so now Hitler's appetite is whet and he wants more land. And so the next thing he's going to go for is the Sudetenland, which is in the country of the former Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia is now the combination of the Czech Republic and the Slovak nation. So anyway, so he wants the Sudetenland because he argues for self-determination again, the Woodrow Wilson idea of self-determination. He's arguing that in the Sudetenland there are Germans. And so he's going to have a meeting about those Sudetenland Germans. You see, Czechoslovakia was created after World War I through the treaties because it was once part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And during the 1930s, Hitler demanded that the Germans be able to unite with the Third Reich. So on September 12th, 1938, Hitler demanded that the Germans of the Sudetenland be given the right of self-determination. And so in an effort to avert an international crisis, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, suggested that they meet to discuss the matter, and they decided to meet in Munich. It just so happened the Sudetenland area was also the heavily fortified region to protect Czechoslovakia. So that was a benefit for Hitler. So he's demanding that area. So Chamberlain meets with Hitler in Germany in September 15th, 1938. And there Hitler bullied Chamberlain. They had a second meeting, all right? And Chamberlain appeases Hitler to maintain peace. And it's called the Munich Conference. So on September 29th, Chamberlain, Premier Edward Daladier of France, and Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator, all meet and they exchange promises. Hitler promises to respect the rest of Czechoslovakia's sovereignty in exchange for the Sudetenland. Hitler also promised not to take any more European territory. And on September 30th, Czechoslovakia, even though they were not invited to the Munich conference, agrees. Okay? And so we have the Munich conference. I'll let Neville Chamberlain tell you in his own words.
Of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I would just like to read it to you. We, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister have had a further meeting today and are agreed in recognizing that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for the two countries and for Europe. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again. We are resolved that the method of consultation shall be the method adopted to deal with any other questions that may concern our two countries, and we are determined to continue our efforts to remove possible sources of difference and thus to contribute to assure the peace of Europe.
After that conference, Winston Churchill said, "We had the choice between dishonor and war. We chose dishonor, and we'll have war." And that will be our next lecture, the start of the war. Till then, hope you enjoyed.